Okay, I would like to welcome everyone to EBMUD's Landscape Advisory Committee General Meeting with a special presentation on native plant design and maintenance considerations in the context of fire. My name is Kristen Bowman, and I am a water conservation representative with East Bay Mud. And just a little bit of background, if this is your first time joining a Landscape Advisory Committee meeting, the landscape industry and EBMUD have been working together for the past 30 years, coming up with sustainable landscape design, installation, and maintenance practices, and promoting that throughout our service area. So one component of what we do is get together 4 to 6 times a year and also work on special projects together. So a little bit of logistics before we get started with today's meeting. You guys do have access to the chat, and the chat is really more for you to be talking to each other. If you have questions for myself or for our for the speaker today, if you could use the Q&A button, and then the chat is really just for community communication. So we will be using the Q&A, and halfway through the presentation, we'll have a chance to answer some of your questions, and then again at the end. This meeting is being recorded, so being on this webinar, you are agreeing to be on a recorded webinar. At the end of the meeting, there will be an evaluation that's sent out to you, and if you wouldn't mind filling that out, taking about 30 seconds, and also giving us some ideas about what you would like for our next meeting. I really draw on your ideas to put together the next presentation. So before we begin, just a few announcements. There is some new legislation that came out this October. One is the California Code of Regulation now requires all sprinkler spray bodies sold in the state to be pressure regulated. That is an effort to save water. So to get more specifics on this new legislation, you can visit California Code of Regulations, Title 20, Section 1602. Also, during the fires, Gavin Newsom wrote the Executive Order N8220, which calls to conserve California's biodiversity, combat climate change, and expand sustainable landscape management practices in public lands and urban green spaces. So this is works really well with water conservation as a way of life. And it really speaks at a higher level what this committee, the Landscape Advisory Committee, has been working on for a number of decades. So, I was happy to read this and see this being articulated for the whole state. And you may want to take a look at that and see what they're calling for. A new resource, Nora Harlow and Saxon Holt, they were the authors of the EBMUD plant book. They are coming out with gardening in summer dry climates, which I believe is going to be more about maintenance of native plants, and that will be available in January. Oh, God. CMPS has received a grant from the USDA to promote native plants throughout the state. Anne-Marie Benz is heading up that effort, and she's looking for more nursery staff managers from Northern California to help us with that campaign, selecting, which would include helping us select what native plants we are really going to promote in that campaign. So if you're interested, Anne-Marie can be reached at abenz@cmps.org. The Water Conservation Division is working to translate materials and programs for non-English speaking landscapers. So we may be tapping into some of you who are bilingual to help us with that effort. And at this point, I don't have actually anything new to call out for the Landscape Design Assistance Program. We are trying to find a model that will work for our district. I will let you know that we are continuing to work on that effort. A little bit about our water supply. So just to note, this data was taken before the rain we got this weekend. It was taken on Thursday. But if you go to the percent full middle column and take it down to the bottom, you see we're at 73% full. Our reservoirs are 73% percent full, which is about average for this time of year. And again, we're still benefiting from spillover from a year ago. What we did experience was a very dry year. And as you can see from our precipitation levels, again, this does not include the rainfall that we got this weekend. We're at about 30% of average. So it is, if you think it's been dry, it has been dry. So we definitely appreciate this rain that happened this weekend. But the message here is always continue to be vigilant in saving water, both indoors and outdoors. Okay, so we are going to transition to our guest speaker, and Jennifer de Graaf.
And your poll?
Oh yeah, in just a second.
There we go.
So Jennifer, while Jennifer is getting her presentation together, do a quick intro. Jennifer will present on designing and maintaining native plant gardens. She's going to demonstrate important workflow considerations to design native plant gardens and to reduce hazards in the event of wildfire. This critical thinking method can be applied to a variety of garden settings. Jennifer has 22 years of professional landscape design and project management experience in parks, schools, hospitals, historic properties, estates, private residences. And she also taught for Berkeley Extension in the landscape architect certification program. She's a landscape architect in California and received her bachelor's in landscape architecture from Oklahoma State University. So welcome, Jennifer. And I did want to mention that in the evals from our last meeting in October, you guys brought up maintenance of native plants, design of native plants, and fire resistance. So we kind of pulled that all together to combine it into one presentation. But before we begin, we want to ask you this question in a poll. Which is the most important, design, installation, or maintenance to make your landscape more resistant? If you could answer this poll. Great, thank you for answering. And just give you a couple, we'll give you just a couple more seconds here. All right. And I'm going to end it. So we're at 44% believe design is the most important, 1% believe installation, and 54% say maintenance. Very interesting. Thank you for filling that out. And Jennifer is going to now lead us into what the truth is. Oh, Jennifer, we can't hear you. Hold on. Can you unmute yourself? Let's see. Could you see that unmute?
Got it. Okay, I'm good. We knew something was going to go wrong. Okay, so I'm going to take over from here. I want to show you, oh, dang it, let's go. There we go. So in that question, that was kind of a trick question. The design absolutely is important. The maintenance absolutely is important. The installation is also important. And all three of those need to work together because there are opportunities during construction and installation when you can be basically screwing up. and compacting soils, which will make everything else less successful. You plant trees too low or too high, and they're going to have chronic stress from various sources. There's a bazillion ways in which the installation and the construction of a project can shortchange both the design and the maintenance. So all three of those need each other. And right here on this slide, I need to tell you that we discovered in our test run that I need to turn off my camera so that you can hear me the most consistently. So I'm going to disappear in a sec. But before I do, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to thread the needle here between design, California native plants, which is what this talk was supposed to start about, and the fire risks and the safety issues. Now, I could talk for a couple of hours on any one of those and still never teach someone how to design all about native plants or all about fire. I'm going to try to stay on target and be in the middle of all three of those. And as we launch and I turn my camera off, if I can still do that, I think I can.
Hey, Jen, you sound great if you want to keep your camera on. And if
Okay, I'll just leave it on. If
it gets a little wonky, I'll let you know.
Yeah, if it gets funny, let me know. Okay, so then I want to make sure to bring up here, if I run out of time, and Kristen's going to tell me, there's resources at the end of this that I may not get to, but they're in the deck. So you'll have access to that. There's some really great stuff in there. And I just, in case I run out of time, okay, I can be chatty, then I'll leave that to you to discover. Okay, so here we go. Why natives? Like, duh, okay. We want to use natives aesthetically for a sense of place, environmentally for the environmental benefits, and also to preserve habitat because that is an environmental benefit to all of us. And the environmental benefits are pretty far reaching if we use natives in a way that actually allows these benefits to be reaped, so to speak. So hypothetically, if we're using California native plants, they're adapted to where we're using them. But California is an enormous state, and it has as much diversity in its plant material and its plant communities as we have in the people that live here. We have a huge range of soil types. We have a huge range of native plants, and you can't just grow everything that you want to grow because it's native to California, because they may not be compatible with your location, with your soils, with the other plants, or with the watering. And so if we're doing it well, we have fewer inputs, we use fewer resources, we use less energy, less water, we generate less pollution, we contaminate everything like water and soil and the air less. It's healthier overall, but caveats apply, like I just mentioned, which is that we need to be choosing plants that like what we have to offer. And I know that in this landscape group, we have basically a lot of people who are working on projects and specific sites and that kind of thing. So we need to be aware of where we're designing or maintaining or installing and what's going to work on that spot, not just because it's in California. But I've got a whole mess of things to show you as we go through this. So you need plants that prefer your soil type, that like the conditions you have to offer, that will take the sort of sun exposure and the wind that you have, that can work together with their water needs, that they're grouped appropriately. And if we're designing with plants that require maintenance that whoever maintains it can't do or isn't capable of or isn't being paid to do, then that's a point of weakness. So we can't just design and expect that it will be taken care of appropriately unless we follow it all the way through and make sure that the maintenance people know what they're expected to do for that design. And I'm only going to mention the habitat thing because you have a lot to keep in your head. But it's better to retain habitat than to try to replace it. Mother Nature does this better than we can. But also there's like 5 different major categories, and it's really easy to say, oh, we want to create habitat, let's get flowers for pollinators. Boom, we're done. let's leave the seed heads on so that birds can eat the seeds and then not just deadhead everything. And that's a source of food. But we also need to keep in mind that those animals, all little critters that live with us here in California, they need shelter and nesting sites. They need host plants for insects that are in specific kinds of life stages. And also we have issues with the availability of these plants in nurseries. And right here, I want to mention that I've talked to some nursery like growers, and during COVID, it appears that the diversity that's available has been lessened. The growers had to let some people go or put them on furlough and shut down. A lot of the wholesalers did the same thing, and everybody sort of peeled back. And then the diversity that they had at each location or within each business really wasn't able to be well cared for. And so we have less diversity now, but we are the market. So if we're asking for California native plants and we want to grow something that's not readily available, we need to keep asking so that we can get that biodiversity back. That's on us. And so let's talk about this. The built environment is different from the natural environment that these plants were adapted for. So California natives, wherever you're talking about, they're adapted for that location. The thing is, that location doesn't look like it used to. It's now, especially if we're involved, because we're not talking about unadulterated spaces. These places are, they're hotter, they're drier. We've tinkered with the soils. We have less diversity to start with because we're reliant on the nurseries to provide the plants or preserving what was there before. And then we have more pollution and we have different values. A lot of clients would be kind of weirded out if we just said, hey, let's just leave it and go natural. And they'd be like, what are you here for? So we've got to work the system so that we can make it successful. And also with climate change, what used to be native, like say to my backyard, might not like the way my backyard feels anymore, because it's not only the built environment, but it's a heck of a lot hotter. Climate change has changed what this location feels like and what it's like to grow here. And it's changing it faster than our plants are evolving. And so the plants that might grow here naturally, if we were to start, the origin of time now, might look different than what it was 20 or 50 years ago, because those plants, they would self-select for being able to grow here. And some of the things that used to be native might not be able to grow here anymore. Okay, so here's something that's an absolutely enormous topic that I can't get into, but basically the structure or the property that does not burn, that doesn't ignite, doesn't burn. And that is square one for fire mitigation. Home hardening is number one. We can look at the landscape all we want, but if we don't defend the structures first, then we're not getting anywhere. We're absolutely not going to win. So I'm going to burn through some fire things pretty quickly. There's a lot to keep in your head at once as we go through the next part. And so I hope it's not too fast. But basically, home hardening is number one, but embers are the biggest threat. I know when we think of fires and wildfires, you see these flames and it's insane and it looks freaking terrifying. But embers are the biggest problem, and embers can blow pretty easily. Direct flame contact is sort of an obvious next threat. And then heat energy transferred from a fire is a huge source of fire that I don't think we think about very much. But all it has to do, let's say you're holding your hand up to a candle like in the image, it just has to heat from radiation, convection, and the other one that I forget right now. It just has to heat that substance, say the hand in this case, to the temperature of ignition. So when people say, oh, I'm putting fire resistant plants next to my house, I don't care that they have moisture in them, or that they're hydrated or whatever. All they have to do is get dry and hot enough to ignite. Just because they're succulents, for example, doesn't mean they can't ignite. And so that temperature of ignition, those 3 words at the bottom of the slide there are really important. So fire can go any direction it feels like. It can be insanely unpredictable. Wind has a tendency to blow it, and the embers especially, in whatever direction. But fires can create their own wind, because that whole thing about hot air rising, a fire can cause wind to go in another direction that's unnatural otherwise. Let's say a fire was going uphill, but a strong gust comes back the other direction, it can blow it in the other direction, as long as there's fuel to keep it alive as it goes. So most of the time fires will go uphill, and most of the time they'll go in the direction of the wind, but then they kind of seem to have their own mind about things like that. Lighter fuels like dry grasses that don't have a lot of substance to them, a lot of meat on the bones, I like to say, they flash and they'll burn up super quickly, and then they're done. But they can also create a lot of embers because of all those little tiny parts. Intense heavy fuels like dead trees, they've got a lot of meat on the bones. There's a lot of substance there, the trunks and the branches, they'll burn for a good long time, and they'll continue to create those embers for a good long time, and they'll continue to heat everything and dry everything out for a good long time. And so that's something that you wouldn't want close to your house or close to a structure, so that it can't transfer that energy, as you know, over that longer period of time, to other things that you don't want to have burn. And fire ladders, I want to show you an excellent example of those in a minute. So I tried to understand this, and I had a conversation with a fire scientist, and he pointed across this parking lot. We were somewhere out in the middle of Berkeley at his office, and he said, look at those eucalyptus. If a fire came along, it would have a hard time keeping those ignited. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's eucalyptus. That's, you know, automatic, instant fuel, go, go, go. And he kept trying to explain to me, it's not quite that simple. And I just couldn't understand that. So I had this conversation with another friend who we sort of brainstormed, like, why would he say that? Because he wasn't crossing the barrier to my noggin trying to get this point across. And it's about energy. So the size that matters, the thing that can hold the heat, hold the flame going, and keep things burning, that energy needs a lot of energy to keep going. And so, like, if you were trying to ignite kindling, that would be really easy, but it would be gone pretty quickly. If you try to ignite a log in a campfire, so to speak, that would be harder to ignite. And so I think that's where he was getting at, is that those trees, other than the easy stuff like the leaves, he was saying it takes a lot of energy to get it started. And then once it's started, it's not a given, if it's not already dried out, to keep that going. It has to be enough energy to keep the water going away and to hold everything at the temperature of ignition so that it can burn. And so that was really hard for me to wrap my head around. So let's keep going. So I love this photo. I don't know this woman. I don't know why they're doing this stupid thing, but it's a rule of thumb, and it's not universal, but that if you ignite a plant, then the flames will be 3 times the height of that plant. So if you look at these grasses, the flame, and that, granted, there's that one big thing up in the middle, but for the most part, the flame is in proportion to the fuel. And here's your fire ladder. A lot of diagrams show these little ladders, and they try to make it graphically represented, but I thought this was really pretty awesome in that there's a lot to be intuitively observed from this image. And if you look at it, the flames are blowing away from the fuel front. So there must be a breeze or something that's causing them to lean back. And that shrub there on the left has completely ignited and is totally toast. But it doesn't seem, maybe it's the angle, I didn't take this picture, but it doesn't seem to have ignited the canopy that looks like it's directly above. And as this flame front, I don't see a lot of embers here, as it goes towards that conifer, just looks like a pine tree from here, but it's very pixelated. You see those little tiny twiggy branches down at the bottom? That's one of those maintenance things that we've got to be keeping an eye on, because those little dry twiggy bits that this tree naturally produces are going to be the ladder that the grass fire can take up into the canopy and overcome being a grass fire. And it can then climb up in there. And as long as there's enough fuel that's ready to burn and it can keep going, and this is a conifer, so that's probably not too difficult, it'll be able to get up into the canopy through those little tiny branchlets and get up higher and become more intense and stay lit on this tree long enough that the substantial parts of the tree also ignite. And I'm going to show you a photo of something kind of cool. Whoops, wrong direction. Oh, I'll get there in a minute. Okay, so I want to talk about this, and I promise I'll remember. IBHS is an organization that works for the insurance industry, but they study fire in like these huge hangars where they've made little houses, and they burn things and they test stuff to see what's going to happen. So I want to talk about these defensible zones, because in 2011, IBHS, I think it was them, they introduced the idea of the interior zone, the 0 to 5. Now, depending on where you're working, you may have a municipality that says, no, our zones are 0 to 30 or whatever. The numbers aren't, to me, so critical as understanding that each of those zones, each of those rings has a different level of impact scientifically or statistically. And this 0 to 5 that IBHS is really hot on is super, super, super important. And it's all about that heat igniting the thing from within 5 feet. And if you're thinking about heat transfer and energy, that makes perfect sense. So we want to keep that 0 to 5 really, really clean, really, really non-combustible. And the zone is designed just to protect they're focusing on a building from ignition, but they include going all the way around anything that's attached to the building, really, which is like decks and stairways that aren't the building themselves, but also can carry that flame closer in. And so those are all important. And then I underscored here the creating and maintaining of that zone, but also that this is from radiant heat just as much as direct flame. And so I made a little diagram. You guys know 0 to 5. I would say 0 to 5 doesn't go in and around the little nooks and crannies. If you see that front entranceway to that home, that whole interior space leading up to the front door, that would be just as important as any other part that's only 5 feet away. That's a great place for embers to collect, for little, dry leaves to blow into and stay in the corners and the nooks and crannies. We got to keep an eye on that. Okay, so defensible zones are there so that they can be defended if someone is there to defend them. They are not a promise of defense, and they are also not a promise that that defense will be successful. And I think personally, when I say defensible zones to lay people without really explaining that that's no guarantee, they get the word defense, it's defensible and yay. And they think, oh, if we just make this thing, then we're going to be okay. And I think we owe it to our clients and to people who don't spend all their time thinking about this to be really clear and really realistic that this is not once and done. You don't make it and then you're done. You just don't. And they're not standardized. There's no, set of rules, do this, don't do that. There's no standard between, different organizations, municipalities, advocacy groups. There's no just, this is it, and that's all you get to do. And also, there's no rule that you can't do this wrong. There will probably be, and there may be places now that are starting to put those in place, but we're kind of in the infancy of the design side of doing this. And there's a lot of people, I think, who are doing really great work, and there's some who are doing really great work, but there's a lot of room for improvement. And also these defensible zones, they can't defend us against embers, and they can't necessarily yet be imposed on structures that have already been built. Someone already lives there, it's grandfathered in, and you can't protect a home with a defensible zone if the home itself is vulnerable, because those embers are going to get through. The point of these defensible zones is to slow the fire's progress, to give us time. It's to reduce the flame height so that it doesn't keep throwing embers farther, so that it can't jump and leap as much. It's to give us a way out, because if you have your defensible zone and it's not defensible, then you can't get out. And a firefighter can't get in, but a firefighter also won't get in. He won't go in there if he doesn't see a way out either. And so that already just shame. And it's a goal if it's possible for you to do. So here's where it's very, very difficult to do. This is my side yard. A few years ago, it doesn't look like that anymore. It's actually kind of worse, because my 0 to 5 zone isn't even 5 feet wide. That pathway there is about 18 inches. It's pretty tiny. And that planting bed is much better now. It has a lot less garbage in it, but my neighbors have planted big evergreens, big redwoods right up next to the fence. So it's a process, and it's not perfect, and I'm not in control of my neighbors. So, sometimes our projects just don't have enough to really build that in. And sometimes it's too difficult. Sometimes it's infeasible. So that zone needs to be as non-combustible as possible. There's some problems here. We've got weeds growing up next to the house. We've got stuff growing in cracks. We've got all kinds of things. Do I think a firefighter would go down my side yard? No, I don't. So because I know that, I need to be sure that I keep it as clean as possible. But I also know that it's not going to save me. It's not going to make everything okay. And also that zone, if you've got larger properties, it really needs to buy you a way out that gets you out. You got to get all the way out. You can't just go down a little front path only to still be, 100 feet from your car and not in a zone that you can traverse. So we've got to be looking closer at long driveways, footpaths. In Berkeley, there's all those spaghetti trails and stuff. And those, if a road is blocked, that may be the way out. And so we've got to be really careful about how we take care of and know where the trails and the footpaths are, and also windows and doors. So let's think back up close and personal to the house. If I've got plants or something planted directly under my bedroom window, and a fire comes in the middle of the night and my bedroom window is the way out, I don't want to be jumping into flaming bushes. I want to be jumping out into a space that I can get out into and then make my way off the property. Maintenance has to be ongoing. Those people that answered the question up at the front with maintenance, you're not wrong. It's just that all of those aspects, design, construction, and maintenance, have to work together. But with this and with clients, there needs to be a better understanding of how the maintenance must be ongoing, and it has to constantly adjust for the conditions. And also the environmental impacts. So I had a little argument with that fire scientist, because I was saying, if you just make the first 5 feet around everything paved, then aren't we consuming a lot of materials? And isn't that just going to make it worse with climate change and more paving and less stormwater infiltration and fewer plants and all that stuff? And his argument back was, sure, it's more paving potentially, but what about the the environmental impact of all these homes burning down and then having to be rebuilt. And so we've got to balance that. And I really personally think we need to change the way that we design properties so that we don't have foundation plantings and then a path. We need to rearrange it so that we're not just adding more paving and adding more hardscape. We just need to put it in places, and we need to do a beautiful job so that we can afford to take that paving and those resources and use them more wisely to protect their structures. Okay, so to keep going with this, that next zone, the 5 to 30, that's about getting out and really thinking about those other places like driveways. And again, this is all about slowing things down. So as a fire gets going and it starts to get this momentum and it gets hotter and it keeps running and running and running and everything's burning, that intensity is really enthusiastic. And we need to find a way, the closer it gets to neighborhoods, the closer it gets to our homes, the closer it gets to those things, we take it down a notch. We just kind of calm it all down and we make sure that our paths are traversable. This is really hard when we live so close together. And I do not advocate that we just chop down all the trees and think that that's going to do it. But I do think that we can do a lot to help mitigate it as we go. Okay, so I know that's a lot. Are there any questions so far? Kristen is going to, she was gathering questions and she's going to help me by reading them out. Kristen? Kristen? Or not?
No, here we go. Hi. So I don't see anything in the Q&A yet, but I did, Laura Hanson, we are a Bay Area native plant nursery and we did not have to close and our sales and diversity have been robust. So
yay!
A bit of a different story for her. Great, that's great, Laura. Okay, I'm next to an open space, oak trees in the far distance. Would a thick layer of wood chips be recommended or could they create embers should a fire occur?
No, and I'll get to that.
Okay, we're going to get to mulch in the next piece of it.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to that very question, actually. And if I fail, remind me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Aside from gravel, concrete, which would be prohibitively expensive and hot, what treatment do you recommend for the 0 to 5 combustible, non-combustible zone?
Okay, so in that 0 to 5, if it's not going to be paved and it's not going to be gravel, and I'm glad you said that because I'm not a big fan of the gravel, then I would say compost, because if you're not paving it and it's not a path, I mean, you didn't say if this is a walking area, then I would say compost is one of the least combustible things we have. And second to that, I would say that a partially composted chunky mulch would be an excellent ground plane surface. So that is something that if you want to see some studies, my email is at the end and you should email me and I'll send you a couple of studies because there's one out of Arizona and one out of Nevada that looked at that. And they're specific to mulches and ground plane surface treatments. And I can send that, no problem. But yeah, if it's going to be a path for walking and it's intended for that, then I don't love the paving, but the next best thing would be compost to have a soft path. Why not have a soft path that's not planted? Anything
And
else?
I don't think she was necessarily referring to a path just for that whole
Yeah.
5. And
Yeah.
so you could have some low growing plants in that 0 to 5 in the composted mulch.
So yeah, a lot of people are putting low growing plants. I'd say it depends on your site and your structure and where the fire is coming from and where you're likely to try to escape from. So and that's a lot. So if you have a low growing plant, let's say it's a foot tall, that's not a foot. Let's say it's a foot tall, then the flames can be 3 feet tall. And if it's right up against your siding, is your siding wood siding? Is it combustible? Is there a layer inside that could get hot enough to combust, even if it doesn't get in touch with the flame itself? If you have wood siding, it should not be coming down. Some homes have stucco on the bottom and then wood on the top, or they're all stucco, or they're masonry. All of those things come out of the home hardening question that I just can't get to here, and they're excellent resources. And if you want those, email me. But yeah, even little plants can make a flame that's big enough to be impactful. And so that's the problem. And if those little plants are making that bigger flame in a place where you don't want it, then you gotta not have them.
Okay, how do we stay ahead of the curve as far as plant selection and changing environments due to temperature increase? What trends do you see and what no longer grows in its original habitat?
That is so, yeah, it is so hard. It's changing faster than we can keep up. At least for me, there may be somebody who's better able to say what natives are moving north. It appears that plants, like, you know, the hardiness zones, those zones have just been redrafted. They all moved. So if you're working under an old map, get yourself a new one. The natives, I don't know if they're moving because I'm not a naturalist and I'm not a forester. Like, so out in the wilderness, are they moving? My guess is yes, but I don't have that data. I would say if you're looking at something that used to be native here going north, you might want to be looking at something that used to be native here, or that is native here going south, like as far as the range that you're looking for your plant selection, because these heat zones are moving up so that every place is getting warmer. Yeah, I wish I had.
That's a good response, to take a look at what's growing a little bit south.
Yeah.
And how do you measure out from the roof line? Do you measure out from the roof line? So how do you measure that zero?
Oh, okay. So there's two things going on. This is a question I should actually write down so I don't forget to answer this in the future. It's not the roof line, it's the footprint, because theoretically we're looking at a flame front, but we also need to be hardened against the embers. So it's like everything all at once. But it's not so much the roof line for the flame front, it's the footprint, which is why we include things like decks and wood stairs and porches and anything else that's attached down at the ground level, at the human level. Up above at the eaves, you want to make sure you don't have trees and branches overhanging the roof line, because then if a canopy fire or if an ember comes and ignites that stuff that's up high, it can throw embers, and they don't always blow. Sometimes they just drop. And because if a piece of tree falls off or breaks off, that's an ember. It could be as big as my fist or the little bitty thing, but that's an ember because it's a little piece of organic material that is ignited and is on its way someplace else. And so if that falls down on your roof, that's an issue. And I don't know, there's a video that was put out by the 9 counties, the 9 Bay Area County fire organizations. And their claim is, and I have no reason to disbelieve this, but that most structures in a wildfire burn from the top down, not the bottom up. And so you really have to take a look at your vents and your roof eaves and places where embers could gain a toehold and things that might drop down on you. And make sure that air zone is clear and as invulnerable as possible. Anything else?
Thank you. I just wanted to read this comment from CNPS, and they're just saying that the plants that are seeming to have the most trouble, trees are the one group that are having trouble adapting to many areas, but many annuals and short-lived perennials respond to changes in temperature.
Oh, good. Wonderful.
But there's a lot of work shows that plants that are drought tolerant now will do better in our climate. future.
Right. Well, and we can help, without looking at drought tolerant lists, which is all about a plant's response to drought stress. Their responses vary. They may be tolerant, but they could also have dried out a bit, or they could abandon leaves, but hold on to them persistently. And I talk about that in a sec. So drought tolerant does not necessarily mean like inflammable. It just means that it has a stress response that allows it to survive. So that's really about the plant. Now, if we're looking at those tiny little plants that are more adaptable, they also sometimes don't live as long. And so we can't just say, I planted little perennials, I'm done. We have to say, okay, I planted these little perennials, and as they go through their life cycle and as they get older or more twiggy or whatever, I'm going to continue to have to address that. And yeah, absolutely. The trees, their sense of time is very different from ours, and they have a slower change and slower response rate to a lot of things. And so it makes perfect sense that we would find the little guys a bit more movable.
Yes.
Anything else, or should I
think
keep going?
I think we should move on, and we'll take some more questions at the end.
Yeah, great question so far.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so basically we want to do, I'm like, now plants, yay. We want to match our plants to our conditions, which I started to kind of hint at in the beginning, and not try to do it the other way around. This is going to be an exercise in restraint. I love all of the plants. I love all of them. I want all of them all of the time. But if I lived here out in what I think is Joshua Tree or something like it, I wouldn't import roses just because I like them. That would be completely inappropriate to do. So we need to be matching our plants to what we have to offer and not try to change the soils, change our practices, change our site to meet the plants that we would prefer to buy. And I'm, that's sad because I want all of them. Okay, I'm going to pick on my favorite thing. My favorite thing to pick on is plant lists. I know that a lot of people want great plant lists. We want more plant lists. And I grapple with this a lot. I've used plant lists as a jumping off point, but plant lists are not for shopping from. Plant lists are a homework assignment. That is a starting point so that you can take those plants on that list for whatever the list was written for. Maybe it's a list of plants for stormwater, infiltration basins, but you still need to take that, make sure that the plants on that list have also been vetted for everything else, like water and air and your soil type and where you are and everything. So the plant list, there's some bad juju. We have a lot of public pressure to produce lists because I think that people expect that if they shop off a list, that they'll have better chances with those plants. Unfortunately, a lot of the lists out there, especially for fire, are just reiterated. They're just regurgitated. Nobody has done a comprehensive study to say these plants are this and those plants are that, and this is what you should plant. No list knows anything about your site, your conditions, your maintenance, your client, your issues. They just don't. That list is static. It doesn't know you. So it's a very, very poor practice to look to lists to answer all of your questions. You must continue and further study them. The good is when you're looking for lists of plants and lists that address something really specific, like plants that like sandy soil or plants that like clay soil. That's about attaching to your conditions plants that might take that. And then you got to still look them up for all the other aspects. You have to cross-reference things. You have to build your understanding so you know these plants and not just work off of lists and not just work off of books. You've got to be able to evaluate them yourself. Also, because let's say your client says, well, I like this plant, I want to use this plant, or heaven forbid me, I'm going to say, oh, look, that's pretty, I want to bring it home. I need to know if I'm actually making a good investment. And I have to cross-reference this stuff. I have to understand that plant to know if it's going to like what I have to offer. And so this is a lifelong, career-long situation where we cannot continue to just look to plant lists to give us the easy answers, because those answers aren't going to work like we expect them to, and we need to use good judgment. Where these lists really fail is in fire. And I know that's a controversial statement because everybody and their dog is publishing a plant list for fire right now. So here's the thing. When it comes to plant lists for fire, again, there is no standard. What does fire resistant mean? Does that mean that that plant will stand there and hold off a flame with a bucket of water on your behalf? Or does it mean that that plant will survive the fire and come back from the roots? There's no standard, and very seldom do these lists actually address that question. Resistant in what way? It ignores your site conditions. It ignores the maintenance that these plants have gotten. It ignores their age and their health, all of which impact their flammability. It ignores which cultivar we're talking about much of the time, and it ignores regional differences. These are just lists. They're just generalized most of the time. I would say databases like the CNPS database is much better. And I've got a whole bunch of stuff at the end where you can go and do more cross-referencing more efficiently. And it also, these plant lists don't know anything about your design. They don't know anything about your water or the sun exposure or any of that. And so here's where a plant list may have failed. This is a Google like street view on 880. And I'm looking at some redwoods that I knew were there. They are out in an exposed, hot, reflected heat, crazy built environment between an access road and the freeway, where it's super hot all of the time, which is exactly what redwoods don't appreciate. Are they native here? Yeah. Are they native locally and very nearby? Yeah, but they don't like it right there. So this is an excellent example of how someone probably put those there and they're very, very unhappy. So they're just going to be under chronic stress, and they're going to be constantly more flammable than they would be if they were in a location that they liked. And we have 6,500, give or take, California native species, and I'm thrilled that Bay Native Plant Nursery hasn't had to cut their diversity because we need you to keep it. We have had, I talked to Devil Mountain, and they said, because I was looking for some things in particular, they were saying they were having a harder time sourcing some things, that they were having a harder time getting them locally. They had to go farther afield to bring stuff in, and that was a problem. And so I want to just go through a few plants. You plant native people, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but my hope is to just sort of bring a couple of these aspects together with fire and the maintenance, and hopefully I don't do it a disservice. So there's two lists here that you're seeing. The first one, there's attributes that are natural to a plant, like this cercis, this red bud, naturally has leaves that are about that shape, about whatever size, and they're fairly bendy. That's the kind of foliage that plant has. And so that's inherent. That's about this plant, and it doesn't necessarily have different leaves just because we put it someplace else, right? It's inherent. So fine textured foliage versus coarse, like I would say this is somewhere in the coarser range, not so fine. The finer textured stuff has more surface and less moisture contained within that surface area. And so it's easier to dry it out than if the foliage was coarser and had more moisture in it with less surface area. The more surface area, the more heat exposure, the faster it dries out, generally. Thick versus thin is the same thing. It's all about the surface area to the mass that's holding the water and keeping things from reaching that temperature of ignition. Fuzzy versus smooth is more about how an ember can come along, and is it going to not stick as it goes by, or will it find, oh, there's my hand, or will an ember come along and hit a sort of a fuzzy surface and find it easier to slow down, increase the time that it's in contact and exposure, transferring that heat, drying things out. The more of that contact, the more of that exposure, the more drying, the more flammable. And sap and resin and sticky things have a tendency to be super flammable and really ignitable, and not so much hydration. They're not the water, they're that other stuff that gets up in the moisture and increases its flammability. And then brittle versus bending is a really sort of strange rule of thumb, where things that are more flexible are possibly going to have more moisture in them than, let's say, dry wood, a dry twig or dead wood. I think that there's a lot of plants that are somewhat brittle. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're dried out. It's just sort of inherent. So I'm not as fond of that one. And then fragrant foliage is all about those oils in the foliage that make that plant fragrant. It's those essential oils that you're breathing that you can smell. And we're not really talking about the flowers being fragrant or not fragrant. We're talking about the mass, the vegetation being fragrant that impacts its flammability. But here's the thing those lists can't do. It's the variables. So if you have a plant that's lived a while and grown some old scrabby twigginess in it, or it's getting old and it's not retaining its moisture as much, or it's not taking up things as much, maybe it's slowed down its growth cycle and it's not pulling the moisture out as much. Those are things that can impact flammability, or maybe it's just on the decline because it's at the end of its life cycle. Life cycles and seasonality. There's some trees at the bottom of my block that when fall comes, they go dormant and their leaves go fully on brown and dry, but they don't drop. And so right there in October, we have these trees that, because of their life cycle, because of their seasonality, they're dry right at the moment when everything else is driest, and they're holding that flammable foliage right at the moment when we tend to have wildfires. So that's something that I would be really, really careful of. Growth rates, things that grow super quickly are not necessarily as dense. And so, because it takes time to put on all that biomass. And so those things can ignite, because they're less dense, somewhat more quickly, but they also don't burn as long. And so there's a trade-off there. And then stress response, like these mimulus in this photo, I can't tell you if these were stressed, the one on the right, because it had too little water or too much water. But either way, it's having a stress response. And so we need to be very careful about keeping things healthy so that they can be as well hydrated as possible and as resistant as possible, regardless of what kind of plant. If I planted 2 mimulus and one of them is stressed out, then it doesn't matter that I got mimulus off of a list, because obviously that didn't matter here. Okay, so the super native plant geeks are going to run rings around me on this, but with Quercus agrifolia, I had a conversation with a client a little while back, and they really wanted to know, what can I plant under oaks? And I kept coming back and saying, well, what can you plant might be the wrong question. So for that person who's curious about oaks, we're here. Oaks like not having summer water. They live off of, and they are reliant on the biology that, let's say we have soil up to here, there's the soil surface, and all their leaves come down and drop and live here. There's life under the soil that's right there that is designed and evolved to use that leaf litter and provide nutrients to the root system of those trees. So if we have that soil surface and we go out and we keep taking all the leaf litter away, we're starving the life in the soil. And then if we go and we don't do that, but we put a bunch of mulch on top, now we have a barrier between leaf drop and the life in the soil. And so if we really want to support that oak, we need to support the thing that supports it, which is the healthy soil and the life in the soil that's dependent on that leaf litter. And so that kind of thing drives me nuts when people are like, well, what can I plant? And I'm like, it's not about you. if you want to keep that tree and you want to keep it healthy, it's about what does that tree want, not what do you want. And so that's not a lesson my clients enjoy hearing. But we also need to be careful about the impact that we have onto those canopies, because every time we impact, and particularly with California native oaks, they are sensitive to that. We can start them on more chronic stress, more impacts. We go digging holes in their root zone, and we're causing them little tiny injuries and opportunities for infection. And that's the big reason we don't want to water them in the summer. It's because they're not adapted for that. They live out in the hills where there's no rain in the summer, but they're vulnerable. If it's warm and wet, they're vulnerable to infection. And so we want to prevent them from having that. So one of the design things I do is I don't plant under oaks, and I don't replace the leaf litter with mulch, but I would plant near the edges of their drip line with plants that might grow in of their own accord. And so I try very hard not to start that very slow spiral of mortality for oaks by being very sensitive about their sensitivity. And so I would say when it comes to under oak plant lists, I think it's the wrong question, what can I plant? I think the question is really, should I plant under this canopy? And then answer that question.
I just want to let you know it's 3:02.
Yeah. What?
I just want to let you know it's 3:02.
Oh, geez. I gotta burn. Okay. I just said that. So on the flip side, redwoods have really aggressive roots. So they're super competitive. They want a lot of water. They're kind of the opposite of the oaks when you're talking about location and design. And they're designed to accept that fog and turn it into their own irrigation, their own water source. And so they like protected spaces. So that place out on the freeway was completely inappropriate. You see these trunks? I'm going fast. These trunks were burned 2 years ago, and these redwoods are perfectly fine because the fire didn't last in this location long enough to completely destroy them. It destroyed a lot, but not these guys. And so often a fire can come through. Okay, so I just said all this. I'm going to keep going.
That's okay. You're okay. You're okay. You're
I'm
okay,
going,
Jen. No, you're okay.
I know I'm only like, I don't know.
Okay. Even if we go over a little bit, you're okay.
I might have to. Okay,
yeah, that's
so
fine. This is a good part. You're doing good.
So Cercis occidentalis, there's a bunch of different red buds, and if you're talking to your clients about just red buds, you need to be specific and talk about these red buds versus those, because Cercis occidentalis tends to be more of a shrub than a tree. It takes a long time to get up to a substantial size like this beautiful photo here. It's on pretty much all of the fire-resistant plant lists because it has those big, beautiful, floppy leaves with less surface area than volume. And I don't have time to get into the Las Politas fire burn list, but if you Google them and they're at the bottom in the resources, Cercis occidentalis took longer for a person with a butane torch to ignite. So seems to me like that's a pretty good option, but only if it likes what you have to offer. Ribes has a mix of those attributes. So it's got some fuzzy leaves. It has, it doesn't require a whole lot of water. It has an upright habit. So if it's ignited, it could potentially get the flames up a good deal more. So that's a little bit of a trade-off there. It's not too specific to soil type, so that's good. We can use it more flexibly. It's host to a boat ton of butterflies and things, and it didn't ignite very readily. So it's got some things in its favor, some things that may make it a little more, you need to be more thoughtful about where you put it, but it has a tendency not to ignite very easily. Salvia clevelandii, I love these. They smell wonderful. They don't have the longest lifespan. And then if you water them in the summer, it's even shorter, like 3 to 4 years, they'll just croak. They have extremely fragrant foliage, but they are so beloved by pollinators, it's ridiculous. And I would suggest, if you take a look at this, Salvia clevelandii, the straight species, will ignite in no time flat, like 7 to 15 seconds. But Salvia clevelandii, when it was crossed with Pachyphylla, it doesn't have that fragrant foliage, or at least nowhere near as fragrant as one of its parents. And all of a sudden, its leaf burn time is up in the 60-second range. Now, here's the thing. If a fire is coming and our benchmark for good performance is 60 seconds, that's not a lot. So we really cannot be looking to our landscapes to protect us. We need to harden the homes. Oh, good, we're getting close. So Yarrow, the Acalia millifolium, I'm sure I butchered that. There are cultivars that they say in Wu calls are native and ones that are non-native. You see that thing down there at the bottom. And I was like, it's a species. Why is one plant of a species native and another plant of a species non-native? And I found that, like, what gives? And maybe it's form or something else, but it's not easy to look up. And so I looked and I saw that Calscape has 15 cultivars listed and my wholesaler has 26. So if I was really hell-bent on saying this is a native and I needed to document it and use the different plant factor on WCALs, then I would choose from this Calscape list, not my local nurseries list. And then just there's, I don't know what the best answer is here other than checking Calscape. And it's great. It's got some really positive environmental benefits like concentrating heavy metals. It's wonderfully deep rooted, so it can be more resistant to a drought situation. It has a lot of variety with different sizes and heights and gray or green foliage, color range, all of that good stuff. This is one of my favorites. Bouteloua gracilis is a California native, but not here. It's native down like San Bernardino and the deserts and goodness only knows, but not here. But it is tough as nails here. So I read that they say it's deciduous. I find that mine isn't really deciduous. It never goes fully brown. It stays green year round, but it doesn't stay green like this image does. It kind of dies back to a little sort of basal foliage. And, you know, it doesn't have a whole lot of meat on the bones. It's very, very fine. So if it ignites, it'll be completely consumed super quickly. I would be willing to put it near paths. You can mow it down like at the end of the summer. You'll lose all the beautiful little leaves, but I mean, all these the sparkly bits. But, you know, you can mow it if you're concerned, and it's super tough. Its roots go straight down in a container and make a race to the bottom of the pot. And so every time I plant them, I imagine them just working their way to the core of the earth. Here's a great example of a plant that's controversial. Coyote bush has fairly flame resistant foliage when it's young and when that foliage is new and well hydrated. But as it gets older, it gets twiggier. And as it gets older, it needs to be pruned back. And so when you're thinking about how do I take care of this native, it doesn't need you unless we're concerned about fire, in which case now we have a maintenance protocol and we should probably give it a little summer water to keep it hydrated, and we should probably cut it back and remove dead wood to keep that kindling out of the middle. And so a lot of plant lists will list it as super flammable or super resistant, but they're not getting into the nuance of what this plant is really like. Okay. This one I'm just going to skip through really quickly. I thought Carex tumulicola and Carex divulsa were the same thing because I've seen them both listed. And I know you plant native people are grimacing. They are not the same thing, but they used to be listed as though they were both native by some nurseries and some places. So one of the things that I learned is that even when I think I know my natives, or even when I think I know a plant, I should just take the minute, go look it up again, because, and there's an article listed at the end in the resources if you want to hear the whole story. But it used to be that this plant, Berkeley sedge, was listed as native. And when you say Berkeley sedge, it sounds like it belongs here. But there are two different species and they're not the same. The other one looks like that. And again, the article is at the bottom that explains a whole this. There it is, right there. Another thing about a plant's life cycle is like with this Blechnum, it has those wonderful vertical fronds that are for reproduction. And when they're done doing their thing and they release the spores, they wither, which means they wilt and they lose that moisture. They're no longer being used by the plant, so it bails on that. And so if we're going to have this beautiful plant, we need to know that parts of it, not necessarily all of it, will become seasonally more flammable because they will wither after they release their spores. And so that's that thing where you need to understand the plant and what its life is like, and then know if you use this, that your maintenance personnel needs to go back at the end of that season and take those verticals out. I'm going to burn past this.
Oh no, go keep it, because I know
No?
people ask
Oh
about
my
it.
God. Okay.
No, well,
so-
someone asked about it in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So if you really want some good bathroom reading, email me. My email's at the end because I have a study for you. Inorganic mulches, meaning the non-wood mulches, the gravels and the pebbles and all that other stuff, they are not great at keeping your soil cool and protecting your plants from the stress of hot surroundings as organic mulches. So wood-based mulches, compost, whatever, they're better at protecting your plants from extremes of temperature. And the stones and the gravels have a tendency to retain the heat and keep it hot and release the heat overnight and then retain the next day's heat. So everything is always warm. And that's not great for hydration. It's not great for flammability for the plants. And the fire industry and the fire safe industry loves this because they look at it and they say rocks don't burn. But those rocks are going to increase our maintenance because we get trash stuck in them, dry leaves get stuck in them, weeds find a great foothold in here, and we have to keep it clean. And if you can imagine, take a look at that picture, picking out pine needles or dry leaves or little bits of organic material, you can turn this thing that is not good for soil health, this gravel situation, into something that's now not only not good for the soil health, it's not good for the environment because of our harvesting and transportation and all of that, but it's also adding to our maintenance nightmares, and it's not helping us, and it's helping to bring and hold organic material where we used it because we didn't want that organic material. So this is not helpful. I don't know any plants that prefer gravel. I don't. I think it's a bad idea. I think it increases our maintenance, and I think it's shooting ourselves in the foot to keep recommending it for fire. So I was asked the question, this total change of topic. I was asked the question, yeah, Jen, but is this more expensive? And I think in some ways, using natives in our landscapes is only more expensive because we have a learning curve. I have a learning curve, our industry has a learning curve, and our maintenance people have a learning curve. Because if we're going to not use as much water, not use as much fertilizer, not do all the things that we have been historically trained to do, and unfortunately so, if we're going to stop those habits, then we need to learn new ones. And that's where the expense comes in. So for designers, we need to invest the time to study and to learn and to ask the questions and to try to figure this out. For maintenance, it's a different kind of investment. If they do it well, they do a lot less maintenance. That may or may not appeal to a lot of maintenance companies. So, there's that. When we start with the site, we're starting with, maybe you have new construction, maybe it's existing conditions, or you already have like someone's yard and you're keeping some things, but not other things. So you want to really take a look at where is your fire probably going to come from? What's the predominant wind direction? Where might embers be blowing in from? Am I uphill or downhill? And how does that work with the wind? Is it more likely that my neighbor's house is going to catch on fire and they're going to ignite me? because my neighbor's a little forgetful? Or is it more likely that some arsonist is going to catch some, an empty lot nearby, and I'm going to get it from that direction? It's really complex, and it's really, you really got to look at that site and see where are all the risks coming from, and like, what do I do about that? And then just gather your options. You've got a bazillion plants and materials and combinations, and you really need to tailor them to that location. And not only the location geographically, but that house. Where are they going to be, if it's a house, escaping from? How are they going to get out of the front yard? How are they going to get out of the backyard? If it's coming from this direction, can they go some other direction? And do we have 2 ways out of the house? If it's a house, 2 ways out of the property, 2 ways out of the neighborhood. If the fire surprises us, do we have an alternate route? And so that's super, super, super important. That's pretty much what this slide is about. We want to start from getting out of the, let's say, house, and then work our way towards getting away from danger in all of those different directions.
So
And
I just wanted to say we are at 3:15.
Okay.
If people have to talk, they have to go, we understand, but I think we'll just finish up this presentation and take a few more minutes, and then take another few
I went way over.
No problem. But we
Way over.
understand if you have to go.
Okay. The workflow is pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty much what I've been advocating for all along, which is, CalScape has a wonderful database. I would combine that with looking up things like the Las Palitas burn list. San Francisco Plant Finder has toggles for if you're looking for plants and things for stormwater specifically, or health strips specifically, then they've already made some judgments about those kinds of things. CalScape has places where you can look at what kinds of native animals or insects and host plants and all that kind of stuff, where they've started to add that in, and I love it. And I love that it's associated with a map, so I can see where things are native, not just if they're native or generalizations. The maps are great. Double check all your invasive lists, because like I said, Berkeley sedge is technically an invasive, not a native, even though I had the idea. My idea was turned around until I did my research. Check to make sure that the plants are available. If you can't find it through one nursery, check the rest of them. CalScape helps with that also. And WooCalls is fabulous because they have a checkbox where if you're searching for plants with certain plant factors, you can make sure that that's narrowed down by California natives. It's not local, but it's California, and then you can go do more work with CalScape and find out where those plants are native to. Plants with the same water needs really need to be planted together so that we reduce the stress from them getting the wrong amount of water. Too much water can be stressful, too little water can be stressful. And so we need to make sure that we're being careful of that. But even within a plant factor, if you've got all, say, low water use plants or all moderate water use plants, some of the areas in that hydro zone may be hotter than others. And so you need to adjust how you're going to plant them, or maybe adjust where your water zones start and end. And if you already have irrigation zones that you're working within, keep your plant factors the same within those zones and make sure that you're responding to that, or change it. And use WooCalls, don't use your good judgment. You might be surprised. Design and spacing. So this is just a graphic representation of how the flames can be 3 times the height of that plant. So if we put our plants on our plan in the right place, but then, and I've had this happen, the crew goes out to install. This is one of those places where an installation can really harm our project, because if they take that plant, let's say you see this little tended to be 18 inches away from the edge of a path, but they come in and it's not so big because it's only a 1-gallon plant, and they intuitively sort of snug it up closer. That's not helpful. And so our design needs to make sure that our plants are spaced properly. Our installation needs to make sure that it follows that, because it is really easy, I do it myself, to say, oh, but it's so little, I'm just going to push it over a little bit. And we need to resist that because we're bringing the flames that much closer to the things that we need to protect. This is just a super quick thing to say, we have 6,500 native plants in California. As you whittle it down, that really kind of feels like the creativity is being restricted. This is an opportunity for our creativity to show. And even in just 2 examples with Bouteloua, gracilis, Blond ambition, and a bunch of Yarrow, you can do completely different effects and have completely different looks, even if all I'm looking at is flower color. And there you go. So the cost of doing things is in doing it better and taking the time to get informed. It's about cross-referencing and using plant databases to help us with our efficiency, not relying on lists. They're not a shopping list. It's about using plants that like what you have to offer, because we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't, and that it's healthier overall for all of us, as well as them, as well as the environment. If we do this, it's totally worth it. And that's it. And I don't have time to show you all the resources, but I promise they're below this.
Yeah,
that's it. So
we did give you a lot to chew on, Jennifer,
no.
and that was really tremendous, hitting all those points. If you don't mind, I'm going to take a look at the Q&A. There are a lot of questions that came in.
Yeah.
And we'll have about 100 people on the line. So
yeah.
Let's see what we got here.
Can we talk about Thank you guys for sticking around. I know wow.
Evergreen plants have better fire resistance than deciduous plants.
What?
Oh, do evergreen plants have better fire resistance than deciduous?
No, but that's a great point to make. Most evergreen plants have, if you go back 100 slides, they have sap and resin and kind of a sticky nature to them. So they tend to be more flammable. At the same time, deciduous plants, if when they go deciduous, they actually drop their leaves, that has, let's say this is this is my tree, and those embers can go through. But if I've got all those leaves still stuck here, my embers are going to get caught up in that and have a greater tendency to ignite. So having that room for embers to go through, the longer an ember is in the air or is not hitting something receptive that takes that energy and turns it into more fuel, as long as that ember is not getting a good foothold, it's losing its energy as it goes. And so the longer it cannot hit something receptive, something that will take that and keep the fire going, keep the flame alive, the better. And so those evergreens, they're wonderful and they provide important habitat, but they also are wonderful butterfly nets for embers. And they have a tendency, not strictly, but they have a tendency to have those saps and resins that are very easily ignitable.
Okay, thank you. Can you speak to the need to keep your landscaping hydrated to reduce fire risk?
Yes.
Burn regardless of the species.
Yes. So that's all about putting your plants together with other plants that want the same care. So if you have plants and you look at WUCALs, they have categories: very low water, moderate water, and high. And those categories correspond to a bunch of math that you use in irrigation design. But if I put very low water use plants with high water use plants, nobody's going to be happy. I can't use less water because these guys will die. I can't use a lot of water because these guys will rot out and stress out. So to keep them well hydrated, I need everybody to want the same amount of water and not rot out the root system and not stress out the plant because it doesn't get enough and it's constantly thirsty. So that, in correlation with having your irrigation, whatever method you're using, hand watering or drip or whatever, having those two things matched with your scheduling and everything else is really important to keeping those plants appropriately watered. So you're providing them what they need to thrive and be healthy. You're not providing them with enough to drown, and you're not providing them with a little bit less so that they're constantly stressed. Because it's kind of like, if you're constantly stressed and you're always working and you're working too hard, you finally get a break and that's when you get sick. It's these plants, if they're under this constant stress, doesn't matter what species they are, they're more flammable than they would be if they weren't under constant stress. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Does uncomposted wood mulch, chipped trees get less fire prone over time?
Ooh, I think it depends on how thick it is and how dry things are. So if you take a bunch of wood chips and you lay them out and they stay super dry, but they're a very thin layer on the ground, they'll start to decompose and they will become they'll become more like compost without actually being compost, but that decay sort of takes it down a notch. But if you've got like 3+ inches, you don't reap much more benefit in the water saving aspect of the mulch, but that mulch doesn't get the chance to break down. It doesn't get the chance to form humus and become less flammable. And it's got all those wonderful dry nooks and crannies that could hold an ember and give it a toehold to ignite the next thing. It's like, and they told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends. You need that ember to run out of energy before it has a chance to talk to your friends. And so if it's thin on the ground, it's less likely to be as easily ignited as if it's sitting up above the ground, staying dry, not starting to decompose, and it's got all those nooks and crannies for embers to get in and find nice dry fuel.
I just have we'll just do one other question, and are there any, and this is maybe out of your territory, but are there any resources on various plants' ability to handle coppicing every few years to mimic a burn cycle?
I've heard this and I don't have a great resource. If anybody does, please let me know. I've heard this about Salvia clevelandii, that it's super flammable, but to keep it fresh and all this other stuff. I think it's an approach that you might take with coyote bush. I don't have great resources for this. I wish I did, because it's one of my unanswered questions on my list of things to research.
Okay, and this might also be a little bit of a stretch, but this will be our final question. If exotics needing water have been growing for years under native trees, have they become codependent? Can I remove the exotics and stop watering under trees?
I think when a tree has been treated a certain way for a long period of time, and I want to put a bookmark around this. If you're talking about a long period of time, like say you moved in 5 years ago and you started watering all your native oaks in the summer, to that tree, that's not a long period of time, but it's probably enough that it has started to have some stress about its situation. I'm losing the train of thought. I think it's safe if you want to remove the exotics to do so. If you're talking about things that have a sensitive root zone, you want to do that carefully, and don't just go in and rototill stuff up. But when a tree or really any plant, myself included, has been accustomed to a way of life, then making sudden changes is ill-advised. You want to sort of taper it back and make slower changes and kind of ease everybody back into a new way of living. And with something that is already unhappy with its living circumstances, that might be tapering it into being healthier, and not making that a sudden change is probably advisable. But if you have a really specific plant or a really specific condition, I would talk to one of those specialist nurseries and see if they can give you a better answer than I can.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Packed it in there, and we will be sending the PDF to this presentation And possibly the recording, just got to see if we can launch it on YouTube, but we'll definitely be sending you the PDF. It's Jennifer's contact information. She's super helpful and responsive. And again, I want to thank you, Jen. Please fill out the eval. We do look at that and give us ideas for our next presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your participation and being here today. It's good to see all these familiar faces, familiar names, and see a lot of new names too. Happy holidays to everyone. And we're getting some more rain today, so that's awesome. Awesome for us. So I'm going to close out this meeting, and maybe I'll just call you, Jen, for a quick check-in afterwards, but I'm going to close out the meeting now.
Okay.
Lots of thank yous coming in.
Yep, thank you.